In the early days, the great promise of the internet was right in its name: World Wide Web. That is a global platform that transcended national boundaries and authorities. But as governments and other state actors increasingly seek to exert their power and even sovereignty over cyberspace, might the internet become the splinternet? With us to consider that, in Stanford, California, Eileen Donahoe. She's executive director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University and a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, Dipayan Ghosh, author of Terms of Disservice: How Silicon Valley is Destructive by Design. He's also co-director of the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And in Brooklyn, New York, Scott Malcolmson, author of Splinternet: How Geopolitics and Commerce Are Fragmenting the World Wide Web. He's also a principal at the consulting group Future Map. And it's great to have you three with us on TVO tonight for this important discussion. I want to start by just setting up our conversation by reading something that was written almost a quarter century ago by the Electric Frontier Foundation's co-founder, John Perry Barlow. And this is what he called a declaration of the independence of cyberspace. Sheldon, the graphic, if you would, and let's go. Governments of the industrial world, he wrote, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. We have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. You have neither solicited nor received ours. Okay, Scott, get us started here. That pretty provocative thing was written almost 25 years ago. How would you describe the vision for the internet around this time?
Well, like the French Revolution, what bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. Everything looked as though the single model, as Francis Fukuyama told us, of liberal, open, democratic government, free markets was going to take over the world. And the internet was seen as kind of the as an electronic borderless analog of that speech would become free across borders and the power of the state would wither away. So none of that really has happened, and the powers of the state have steadily increased with respect to cyberspace and the World Wide Web. Initially in the 90s, when you started having the ability to actually participate on the web as a sort of non-geek human being, it was completely dominated by the United States. It was completely dominated by U.S. companies. The real battles for freedom were between the geek community and the United States government, which wanted to control various forms of content like pornography and drug dealing and money laundering. But once those issues were more or less worked out in the 2000s, there seemed to be a relatively open plane of an international platform. Really, it wasn't until the Snowden revelations that governments began to push back really hard against a U.S.-dominated system. Although that had been in the cards since the mid 90s. Really, it was a gradual process of kind of the reassertion of state power up to today, when it continues to be asserted ever more.
Eileen, let me repeat one of the quotes in that Barlow piece. You have no sovereignty, he wrote 24 years ago. Have governments around the world listened to that admonition?
No, 24 years later, absolutely not. We've seen, a radical flip of John Perry Barlow's vision. But I do want to say that at the time, he really did capture something important, and I don't want to forget that. He wasn't wrong in those early days, and he was a visionary and a wonderful, genuinely libertarian spirit, and he was very influential on that early community. And he was right in the sense that at that time, the early internet was a challenge to governments for the very simple reason that, the inherent feature, global, transborder, instantaneous communication, is inherently challenging to a model of nation states defined by territorial boundaries. And it was challenging to governments at the time. And there was a phase for about a decade of this sense of liberty, and that the early days were that the internet would be beneficiary to civil society actors, human rights activists around the world, and that authoritarian governments would not be able to catch up. That was mistaken, but I will say it. Full decade, 2011, the Freedom Online Coalition was formed, which was a coalition of governments supporting this vision of the global, open, interoperable internet for civil society. 2012 was the first UN resolution on internet freedom, proclaiming this idea that human rights must be protected online as offline. It did come to an end the next year with the Snowden revelations, where there was this sense that democratic governments themselves were not adhering to these principles. And on some level, we've almost never recovered from that moment.
Well, DePayan, we now see a situation where we have what Eileen just described. We have Russia pursuing its own values on the internet. We have China certainly pursuing its own way of doing business. Obviously, the expression that we're considering tonight is that it's turning from the internet into the splinternet. Is that how you would describe what we're seeing today?
Absolutely. I think that what we're seeing is something that I'd say is a parallel to the way that the global economy operates, actually, where we have a massive game of more than 200 countries. Each has relationships with the other countries. Some of those relationships are of course, strained in various ways. Some of them are blocked in various ways. And I think we're seeing something similar now with the internet, where, as others have mentioned, at one point this was a tremendously powerful idea that anyone on the globe could communicate with anyone else over this communication platform. But that medium has been, of course, wielded by governments in various ways, in a very similar way to how we see the global economy evolve over the past several decades. And I think increasingly it is becoming a splinternet, spearheaded by the efforts of on one side the United States, on the other side China, and maybe in the middle the European approach, with a lot of countries following suit.
Well, let me follow up with Scott on that. It's probably a given that totalitarian countries would want to get their mitts on this internet, but we've seen democracies also want to do it as well. Were we all a bit perhaps naive to think that this was not going to happen over the course of the last quarter century?
Well, sort of. I mean, as both DePayan and Ambassador Dono have pointed out, you really have to always keep in mind the role of the private sector. The bulk of the internet is built by private companies and maintained by private companies and controlled by private companies, and that's likely to remain the case. And so, it isn't all government. The governments are only one actor. And for example, if you take the big example today, you look at Huawei. Huawei is a large Chinese company that's built 3G, 4G, and now 5G networks around the world. So it's doing that with the help of Chinese state subsidies. So in that sense, it is, you could say, to a degree, an arm of the Chinese government. But at the same time, it is a private company, and the ability of governments are in a contest on the internet and in the web with private companies. They always have been, and I think they will be for a very, very long time. So I think it's very important to keep the private sector part in mind. When Ambassador Donahoe spoke about the early web, the web would not developed as an international platform in a sense if it hadn't been one. By which I mean the companies that developed, whether they were Google or InfoSpace, the successes and the failures, they were building for a planetary platform. If it had not started as a planetary platform, it would have been built out completely differently. I think what we're facing now is the possibility that private companies will have to only innovate for national internet spaces. And that's going to lead to a different internet because they'll develop differently for it. So, in my view, the big spaces are North America, India, China, and possibly Europe, depending on how it is that Europe decides to to regulate these. There is a dividing line between the authoritarian and the democratic. It's become extremely popular in both the Democratic and Republican Party in the United States, and to an increasing extent in Europe, to divide the virtual world into these two categories. I think there are a lot of risks in doing that, but I also don't think it's exactly going to work out that way, precisely because there are too many private actors. The scale of investment is not a government scale of investment.
I do wonder, and Eileen Donahoe, forgive me, I don't know you well enough to call you by your first name. I should have called you Ambassador Donahoe earlier. Scott has really raised a fascinating issue for us on whether or not how democracies handle the internet versus how authoritarian or totalitarian countries handle it, whether those two ideas are, frighteningly getting closer together. What's your view on that?
That's a great question, and the answer has to be somewhat nuanced. So the first thing I would say is that the rise of digital authoritarianism, and in particular the Chinese model of it, is a very concerning development, and it has three dimensions that I would emphasize. One is utilization of digital technologies for repression at home, censorship, surveillance, information control, as well as role modeling that model of those uses to other countries. Second is the export of digital technologies for repressive purposes, as well as the export of infrastructure, especially 5G infrastructure, communication infrastructure, through which they also are able to suck up data back home. And that's the Huawei challenge. Third piece is growing influence in international diplomacy, international norms bodies, especially entities where there is tech governance and standard setting happening. And there is an effort to ensure that the Chinese approach to technology standards and protocols are embedded into the technologies of the future. So that is one very real concern, and we should all keep our eye on that. That said, I agree with Scott that we can't deny the fact that democratic governments also are unconsciously drifting toward authoritarian uses of technology in law enforcement, immigration purposes, because they have not yet gotten their acts together and gotten their heads around how they actually adhere to democratic values and protect human rights in the digital realm. And that is the big responsibility and task for the democratic world.
Well, Depayan, let me get you to follow up on that. I guess China and its approach to things has certainly been an example for other authoritarian countries, but how concerned are you that it's actually becoming also an approach for democratic countries?
Well, I think we're already seeing evidence of this, that it is becoming an approach, and we can look at the United States as one example, of course, where we have a combination of industrial policy now in 2020 and various forms of censorship, foreign censorship, taking place. Now, I'm not trying to associate this with necessarily the Trump administration. I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened in other administrations, but I think we're certainly seeing a splitting of the U.S. and China in governance of the internet, and a lot of it is about retaliation. And I'd make a point here and just suggest that while this, in the current moment, this does suggest that perhaps we're moving further and further into a splinternet, I would also say that a lot of these things might be quite temporary, in the sense that because it is associated with the administration, and because the Trump administration has attempted to retaliate in certain ways against China, as well as other states as well. For instance, India working against China to ban TikTok. In that case, a lot of these a lot of these actions from governments are motivated by underlying politics, and politics are temporary. Politics can shift with the winds, and we might very well see either, of course, we might see the splinternet furthering, in the coming years, or we might actually see people coming back together again, depending on those political circumstances around the world.
Well, let me pursue those notions with Scott. And yes, politics are temporary, but sometimes, Scott, and I'll point you to Iran, temporary has so far meant 40 years, which I guess, when you consider history, that's temporary. But if you consider those of us who are your age and mine, that feels like a very long time. I wonder if you could do some comparing and contrasting for us here. How the Iranian government has attempted to control the internet versus what's happening in Europe right now, and maybe point us to France, where the president there, Emmanuel Macron, has used the term digital sovereignty. So maybe compare what Iran has done with the kind of digital sovereignty that the French are talking about.
Okay. I might bring in a couple of other things too, because particularly as Depayan mentioned India, which is in a whole lot of ways the most interesting place in cyberspace right now. To my mind, what's going to lead to more of a splinter net is not so much governments as it is the private sectors. Most private sectors, including in France, including in India, not perhaps so much in Iran, certainly in other places, Nigeria, Brazil, and so on, they want to have their own tech sectors that will be able to design technological products and innovate for their own, for the good of their own companies. That's not unusual. And that because the technology is so relatively accessible compared to, say, the technology to drill deep drill oil, you can have sectors increasingly sort of flattened across the world. So if you look at venture capital spending over the last 5 years, it was basically about, say, 60% in the US in high technology 5 years ago. Now it's about 45%. So that other money is going to other countries. Southeast Asia is incredibly innovative. There's a lot of investment in Southeast Asia in new technology companies. So my point being that the sovereignty of the cyberspace of a particular nation is in part an effect of the vitality of its own tech sector. That is, to a degree, a political relationship. In India, for example, with this company called Reliance Jio, which just recently invested $20 billion in order to basically take over the telecommunications market of 1.3 billion people. That was done with the cooperation, to say the least, of the Indian government, because it was seen as a way Reliance was helping the Indian government establish cyber sovereignty, particularly in the face of China, but also in the face of US companies and even European companies. Similarly, what Macron wants to do is to create a situation where at least European and probably preferably French tech companies are able to innovate and have a market rather than simply take all their products, whatever Google and Facebook and whomever else are able to send over from the United States, or even worse, whatever China is able to send over from Beijing to France. So the sovereignty question is a private sector question as well as a government question. And in some ways, the private sectors actually lead it and governments end up following. Whether that's a good thing or not is a separate question. But I think structurally, that's the way that it's tended to work.
Well, let me follow up with Ambassador Donahoe and let us do a little navel gazing here, because I'm sure people watching want to know, where's Canada in all of this? And certainly one of the things that we can say about Canada is that apparently, I'm told 80% of our internet traffic automatically routes through the United States. So from a Canadian perspective, this notion of digital sovereignty that the French president talked about, is it basically impossible for Canadians?
Well, what I would say is I hope that the Democratic Alliance, Canada, the United States, the transatlantic partners, find a way to come back together and have a shared vision and rebuild trust. That has obviously been broken, especially during the Trump administration for many reasons, but not exclusively the Trump administration. And yet, at this moment, that is our task. We really do need to find a shared vision for a democratic approach to governance of digital society writ large, for regulation of the private sector, and for thinking about utilization of technology by governments. But I understand why the Canadians might feel nervous or even, feel like they too want to pull back from the United States in terms of where their data is. I think it would be a bad move. And let me also go back to this larger trend of moving toward digital sovereignty around the world. I think we need to differentiate. The China approach is really a model of government control, sovereignty for purposes of saying it's nobody else's business what happens in our borders. That happened pre-digital with the Chinese, and now they're finding a way to articulate that vision in a digital context, and they're doing it very effectively. And it's attractive to other governments who say, maybe we want to have that level of control as well. In Europe, the animating energy behind the move toward digital sovereignty, data localization, is actually the opposite. It is intention to protect the rights of citizens. I would argue it's understandable, but it has an unfortunate effect of really dividing the Democratic Alliance, which I think will become a problem, and that we need to band together our data, our technology, and our norms. We need to come together again. Last but not least, the Trump administration. I would say we hope it ends soon. And it has been an incredible period where incoherence of the policies, and it's not even clear that they're pushing toward digital sovereignty intentionally. It's just ad hoc policies that have that appearance and that don't make sense. When you look at what TikTok and WeChat, both of which have preliminary injunctions against the executive orders, so our federal courts are standing up there. I think their position on Huawei was understandable. I think the movement on the semiconductor industry in China, understandable. But we have to remember they also went after our own private sector platforms with an executive order in May because of so-called censorship against Trump for taking down tweets. And that was a form of retaliation against American companies. So I think we need to just hope we get past this administration and have a rational set of policies going forward that brings the Democratic Alliance together.
I just have to say parenthetically that when you said, we hope it ends soon, Scott laughed and DePayan kept a perfect poker face. So I'm not sure what his politics on that one are, and we're not going to get into it because that's a different show.
DePayan has a great poker face. It's really something. I'm helpless.
No, you let it all hang out. There's no doubt. Well, DePayan, let me put you to work on this issue then, if you don't want to weigh in on what's going to happen on November 3rd. One does note that the European Union have taken some steps to, in spite of the shared values that Ambassador Donahoe just described of Western nations on this, they have tried to achieve some greater digital sovereignty. And, that's the European Union. Is that a possible template for Canada to take if it, in spite of those shared values, would like to have a little more sovereignty over its digital footprint?
Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, I think that Canada, to its strengths, has actually taken some steps already in trying to launch new national privacy initiatives, in trying to renegotiate the balance of power between dominant internet companies and the Canadian citizen in exactly the way that Europe has done. Let's step back for a second and look at the general data protection regulation that Europe put forward. Intellectually, theoretically, I think we can all agree that it's a foundational document. It is fantastic in the way that it gives the consumer rights, rights to deletion, rights to have to consent, rights to choice. Rights to opting out of algorithmic processing. And those kinds of rights fly in the face of Facebook's business model, for instance, which is why we've seen the tech industry lobby against that so hard. So intellectually, it's a fantastic framework. Of course, the way that it works is that the EU puts this principled framework forward, and then the 28 member states have to enforce it in the way that they wish. Which has led to some people suggesting that it hasn't been as effective as it could be, the GDPR. That said, again, intellectually, I think that it is a very protective set of rights and gives Europe and Europeans the rights that they need in perpetuity. And we all would hope that Europe is able to enforce those rights through the member states. If Canada were to do something similar, I think it would be fantastic. And in fact, I think Canada is thinking now about finding ways to renegotiate that balance of power. And to that end, I think that in the United States, we need to do that as well. And to put my political leanings on the table, I'm against the Trump administration in what it's done on this particular issue as well, and more broadly in the same way that Eileen suggested. But on digital issues, digital rights, the Trump administration has not done enough to stand for American consumers' privacy, to stand for competition in our digital landscape, to stand for transparency over the ways that dominant Silicon Valley companies operate. We need to do all of that, and Canada needs to do all of that, and the whole world does, and to really empower the individual consumer at the end of the day.
Well, let me pick up on that. We're down to our last couple of minutes here, and Scott, maybe I'll get you to react to this graphic that I'm next going to read. This is a quote from Rebecca Mckinnon's 2012 book, Consent of the Network, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom, in which she writes, "We have begun to see how absolute power in cyberspace corrupts absolutely as it does in the physical space. As with power in the physical world, power in the digital world must be constrained, balanced, and held accountable. The future of the freedom in the internet age depends on the choices and actions of everybody on the planet who creates, uses, and regulates technology. It depends on whether we assert our rights within the digital spaces we now inhabit, just as our forebears fought for their rights in the physical spaces once controlled entirely by sovereigns who claimed to have the right to rule as they pleased." Okay, Scott, that's 8 years ago. I wonder, 8 years later, what grade you would give the level of freedom and rights that individuals have in the digital world today?
Oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, it depends on where you are. I mean, it hasn't gone very well. I think what Rebecca Mckinnon was getting at, I think, is extremely important. I think that basically what we've seen in the intervening 8 years is perhaps no surprise that basically the way in which citizens express their views is not as a citizen of the world, but as a citizen of a state. It's not the only way, but it tends to be the primary way. And so the reassertion of state sovereignty over cyberspace does not necessarily mean a loss of citizen autonomy and power. It should mean an increase in it. Canada has participated in the Prague Principles discussion on 5G, which is a very interesting forum that began in 2018. Basically, states keeping all the vendors out. They have states discuss the way forward. There were 32 or 33 participants in 2019. September 2020, they had over 120 states participated in the discussion last month. And they are really trying to come up with, and they've come up with a set of principles that get to a lot of the issues that Depine was just talking about. So the urge among states to create a better framework is absolutely there. It's very tricky, largely, again, I think, because the role of the private sector is so great, and it's just simply not like arms control, that it's not up to states they don't control enough of the factors. But the effort is definitely there. It's very focused around 5G. China's policies have focused a lot of minds around the world. The only cautionary note I'd like to interject, because I think it's very important, it gets forgotten, is that China is not a country that's going to disappear. It needs its own tech sector in order to achieve its own goals of growth in the future. And whatever you think of the Chinese government, policies that aim to essentially eliminate its ability to innovate on anything other than a purely domestic scale could be counterproductive in a whole lot of ways that it might be useful to anticipate, rather than just trying to opt for a kind of virtual containment policy and hope for the best, which I'm afraid might be something like what's happening now.
Mm-hmm. That's our time, everybody. My sincerest thanks to Scott Malcolmson, Depine Ghosh, and Ambassador Eileen Donahoe for being with us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much for your help on this, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.